Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some fascinating stuff today. Karl von Clausewitz, his book on war, using those excerpts he sent.
Ah, Clausewitz.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's not just some, dusty old military theorist.
Right, even though he was writing back in the early 1800s.
Exactly. His work is, well, it's surprisingly relevant, I think, even today.
Okay, so what are we focusing on? Like, what's the big thing with Clausewitz in this deep dive?
Well, a lot of folks might think On War is just about battles, troop movements,
Right.
that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Right.
But he actually goes way deeper, like into the psychology of conflict,
Hmm.
how politics play a role, even the role of chance, uncertainty, all that.
That's really interesting. I mean, when you think about it, those things are just as important today, right? I mean, especially uncertainty. It feels like that's everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. The world Clausewitz was writing about, it was changing rapidly, a lot like our own world, actually.
Hmm. Okay, so let's jump into the book. One of the things that really stood out to me was this idea that war is basically like a giant duel.
Oh, yeah, he uses that analogy, doesn't he? The two wrestlers.
Yeah, he compares it to two wrestlers, each trying to overpower the other. So it's like not just armies fighting, but it's really about like a struggle of wills.
Yeah, it's a powerful image, right? I mean, what he's getting at is this idea that war is ultimately about forcing your enemy to do what you want, to submit to your goals, your will, basically.
Yeah.
And that's a huge idea. Really changes how we think about conflict, even today, I think.
Yeah, it's like behind all the military stuff, there's this really primal human element driving the conflict.
Absolutely. But here's the thing, Clausewitz doesn't stop there. He says that while force is definitely essential, it's not just brute force.
So it's not enough to just have the biggest army or the most powerful weapons.
Right. You also need, you need intelligence, and you need strategy. To use that force effectively, think of it like a swordsman, a really skilled swordsman. They don't just swing wildly. There's precision, timing, an understanding of the opponent to win.
Right. Right. You have to know your enemy's weaknesses and use your strengths against them, not just like charge in blindly. Kind of like, a game of chess almost.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where Clausewitz's work gets really interesting for us, I think. Even though the weapons have changed so much since his time, those basic principles of strategy, they're still super relevant.
Okay, so we've got this idea of war as a duel, right? A duel of wills where strategy and intelligence are key. But Clausewitz, he doesn't stop there. He goes on to talk about, well, he famously says, war is an act of policy. So he's connecting war to politics.
Oh, absolutely. He's saying war isn't some isolated thing. It's all tied up with political goals, calculations.
Okay, so you can't really understand a conflict without understanding, like, the political reasons behind it.
The motivations,
Yes.
right. Exactly. And this connection between war and politics, well, goes both ways, right? Like political aims, they shape military actions. But then the war itself, how it goes, that could totally change the political landscape. It's back and forth, always.
And Clausewitz saw this firsthand. I mean, he lived through the Napoleonic Wars, so he witnessed how politics and war, how they kind of feed off each other.
Exactly. And he noticed a big shift happening in his time, too, something we still grapple with, the role of regular people in war.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, in the 18th century, wars were more like affairs between governments.
Okay, yeah.
But then in the 19th century, with the French Revolution and all that, we see more popular participation, the people becoming a bigger factor.
And Clausewitz really picks up on this, right? He even talks about Napoleon's campaigns.
Oh, yeah. Especially the invasion of Russia in 1812. That was a disaster for Napoleon. And popular resistance, the Russian people, they played a huge role in his defeat.
It's almost like he's anticipating this idea of, like, a people's war, which became so important later on.
Right. He's seeing how even a powerful army can be stopped by a determined population. That will to resist. It matters.
Okay, so far we're seeing how Clausewitz thinks about war way beyond just, military strategy.
Yeah.
He's connecting it to politics, to the people involved, to all these bigger forces that shape how a conflict plays out.
Exactly. And this leads us to another key idea, the culminating point of victory.
Okay, culminating point. Now that sounds interesting. What does he mean by that?
He's saying that even when you're winning, on the offensive, there's this point where your strength can actually start to decline.
So you're winning battles, but you're not necessarily getting stronger.
Right. It's like you reach a peak,
Yeah.
and then things can start to shift back the other way. The defender might gain an advantage.
Wow, so even if you're, like, on a roll, victory isn't guaranteed. It's not just a straight line to the finish.
Nope, not at all. It's more dynamic than that. Think about it. As an attacker pushes forward, their supply lines get stretched thin,
Right.
and they have to, hold the territory they've taken. Plus, the troops are getting tired.
So they're winning, but it's costing them. They're getting weaker in the process.
Exactly. And at the same time, the defender, well, they might be able to, regroup, get support from the local people,
Yeah.
start to see the attacker's weaknesses where they're vulnerable.
Ah, so the momentum can shift, even if the attacker seemed unstoppable at first.
Yeah. And Clausewitz, he uses some great examples to illustrate this from the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh, right. Like Napoleon in Russia, that whole campaign in 1812.
Exactly. I mean, Napoleon's March on Moscow, a classic example of this culminating point.
Didn't he, lose most of his army because of, what was it, the weather? The Russians burning everything as they retreated?
Yeah, the vast distances, the harsh Russian winter, the scorched earth tactics, it just drained Napoleon's forces. Yeah. Completely.
It's a good reminder, I guess, that even the most powerful armies, they're not invincible.
Right. The defender can use time, space, strategic waiting, all of that to wear down an attacker.
Yeah.
And ultimately win.
So it's not just about brute force, right? It's about adaptability, too, being able to adjust to the situation to change your plans when you need to.
Absolutely. And this leads us to, well, another fascinating part of Clausewitz's work, his ideas about military genius.
Oh, okay, military genius. So he's talking about, the great generals, the Napoleons of history.
Well, yes and no. When Clausewitz talks about genius, he's not just talking about, battlefield brilliance or tactical skill. It's more than that. It's this combination of intellect, courage, determination, and a deep understanding of all those factors we've been talking about, the psychology, the politics, the whole picture of war.
So it's not just about winning battles, it's about understanding the bigger context, the forces at play.
Exactly. A true military genius. For Clausewitz, they have to be bold, but also calculate risks carefully. They inspire their troops, but also make tough, even cold strategic decisions. It's a balance.
It's almost like they have to have this sixth sense, this ability to see through the fog of war.
Right. Intuition, knowledge, experience, it all comes together. And speaking of fog of war, that brings us to one of Clausewitz's most famous ideas, the idea of friction.
Friction. Okay, now I'm really curious. What exactly did he mean by that?
Well, he used this term to describe all those things that can mess up your plans, even the best plans, the things you can't really predict or control.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So, even with, all the technology we have today, all the satellites and intelligence gathering, you're saying there's still this element of unpredictability in war.
Oh, absolutely. There's the fog of war, sure, but there's also, well, just human error. People make mistakes, especially under pressure. Miscommunication happens, logistics break down, troops get tired. And that's friction.
So how do you deal with that if you're a commander? I mean, do you just accept it as inevitable?
Well, Clausewitz says you can't eliminate friction entirely. No way. But you can try to lessen its impact by understanding where it comes from, planning for it as best you can.
So building flexibility into your plans, having a plan B, maybe
Yeah.
even a plan C.
You got to be able to adapt, improvise when things inevitably go wrong. And this is where, again, that military genius, that sense of warfare comes in, knowing when to stick to the plan, when to throw it out and try something new.
Okay, so friction, adaptability, this military genius. How do these ideas, how do they all fit together in Clausewitz's bigger picture of what war is?
Well, remember, he sees war as this dynamic thing, back and forth between attack and defense, between what you want to achieve politically and what's actually happening on the battlefield, between the rational and, well, sometimes the irrational things humans do.
Right. It's not just about moving little soldiers around on a map,
Exactly. It's messy, it's complicated, it's human. And Clausewitz, he's pushing us to think about war not as this thing with fixed rules, but as a process of constant change and adaptation.
That's what makes him so relevant today, I think. The world is changing so fast, just like in Clausewitz's time. The nature of war is changing too. Technology, everything.
Exactly. Think about cyber warfare, information warfare, terrorism. Clausewitz could never have imagined those things. But his ideas, they still help us make sense of them. Because at the core, it's still about strategy. It's about adapting. And it's about understanding human behavior.
Wow. So even in this age of, drones and AI, this 19th century Prussian general, his ideas can still help us.
Oh, yeah. Big time. And that's why he's still studied. Okay, now getting a bit more specific, Clausewitz also dives deep into the ideas of tactics and strategy. You might be wondering, how are they different? How do they work together?
Yeah, those terms, people use them all the time. But I feel like with Clausewitz, he probably had a very specific way of defining them.
Oh, he definitely did. For him, tactics, they're about winning individual battles, engagements, But strategy, that's about using those battles to reach your overall goal, the political goal, the reason you're fighting in the first place.
Okay, so tactics are like winning a single game, and strategy is about like winning the whole championship.
Perfect. Exactly. And both tactics and strategy, they're constantly evolving. The best commanders, they can adapt them to the situation, the terrain, the enemy strengths, even the political mood.
It's not about just following the same playbook every time.
Right.
You have to be flexible, learn as you go, adjust.
Right. And Clausewitz, he really pushes back against this idea that war is like some kind of science with fixed formulas.
So he's saying theory is important, but it can only take you so far. You have to be able to like think on your feet.
Exactly. There's always friction. There's always human error. Unexpected things happen. You have to be ready for that. That's why he says studying military history is so important.
Ah, okay. So you learn by looking at past campaigns, seeing how other commanders handled those same challenges.
Yeah. It's not about memorizing dates and battles. It's about, well, extracting the core lessons. What worked, what didn't, the patterns of how humans behave in war.
Right. The timeless principles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he was, really critical of theorists who tried to make war sound simple, to reduce it to just formulas.
He thought they were missing the human element, how messy it really is.
Exactly. Every conflict is different, unique. For him, military genius is all about being able to see those nuances, adapt, learn from your mistakes.
And that comes back to friction again, right? You can study all you want, but in the end, you have to be able to deal with those unexpected things, the things you can't plan for.
Absolutely. And that's a big part of why Clausewitz is still so relevant, even in our modern world. The technologies change, the tactics change, but the core challenges, they're the same. Leadership, strategy, understanding human nature, those things are always part of conflict.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about how Clausewitz sees war as this duel of wills, how it's tied to politics, to the people involved, how important strategy is, adaptability, learning from history. What else? What else is important for our listeners to know? What other key insights did Clausewitz have?
Well, one thing that's often overlooked is his ideas about defense. It's not what you might think.
Okay, so most people, when they think about defense, they think about just, holding your ground,
Right.
resisting an attack.
Right. But Clausewitz, he says defense is more than that. It's active. It's about using your resources in a smart way, choosing your battles, waiting for the right moment to strike back.
So it's not just about being passive. You're saying there's like a strategy to defense too.
Absolutely. Clausewitz argues that a good defense, it can be more effective than a poorly planned attack. He compares it to a spring. You compress it, it builds up energy, then boom.
So the defender is kind of like storing up energy,
Yeah.
waiting for the attacker to overextend themselves.
Exactly. And then bam, counterattack. He points out there are, lots of ways to have a good defense. Terrain, fortifications,
Yeah.
deception.
Like those classic examples, the Swiss defending in the mountains, or the Vietnamese using guerrilla tactics.
Perfect examples.
Yeah.
What Clausewitz is saying is, even if your army is smaller or they don't have the best equipment, you can still win.
Mhm.
If you have the will, the determination, if you use your brain and exploit the attacker's weaknesses.
Okay, so defense, it's not just about absorbing blows. It's about knowing when and where to hit back.
Right. And that ties back to the culminating point we were talking about. The attacker, eventually, they reach their limit. A good defender, they can sense that moment
Mm-hmm.
and turn the tables.
That reminds me of, the American Revolution. The Continental Army, they were outmatched in a lot of ways, but they kept fighting, wore the British down, and eventually won their independence.
Yeah, great example. Both sides, attacker and defender, they have to understand this back and forth, constantly assess, adapt their strategies. It's dynamic.
Okay, so much to think about. We've talked tactics, strategy, defense, how it all connects back to Clausewitz's big ideas about war. What else? What haven't we touched on yet?
Well, we can't forget the political side of things. Clausewitz, he was adamant that war and politics they're inseparable. He said, and this is one of his most famous lines, war is a continuation of political intercourse with the addition of other means.
So he's saying war it's just another tool that countries use to get what they want. politically.
Exactly. He really criticized those theorists who tried to, like, separate war from politics. Like,
Yeah.
this pure military thing. He said if you ignore the political side, you're going to have a bad time.
Okay. So to understand any war, you have to understand what each side is trying to achieve politically, what their goals are.
Absolutely. And he even said that war should always be subordinate to those political goals.
Mhm.
Like, the military, they shouldn't be calling the shots. They should be following the political leadership's lead.
Makes sense. Otherwise, the war just becomes about, winning for the sake of winning and not about achieving some larger goal.
Exactly. He was really big on civilian control of the military. The politicians set the goals. The military carries them out. That was his view.
Clear chain of command. Okay, so building on this idea of war and politics, Clausewitz, he talks about limited war and absolute war. What's the difference there?
Right. Absolute war, that's like this is theoretical idea of a conflict where both sides are just all in, total commitment to destroying each other. No
Oh,
limits.
sounds terrifying.
Yeah, no holds barred. But Clausewitz knew that most wars, they're not like that. They're limited in some way.
So there are like boundaries even in war.
Yeah, it could be political reasons,
Yeah.
or maybe the countries just don't have the resources for a total war, or
Yeah.
there's the fear of things escalating out of control.
Right, like during the Cold War, there was always that fear of nuclear war. So even though the US and the Soviet Union were rivals, they never directly fought.
Exactly. And Clausewitz, he's saying, look, to understand war, you got to understand those limits, those boundaries,
Yeah.
because they shape how the war is fought, how intense it gets.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got limited war versus absolute war, this idea that politics is always shaping things. Um, Anything else about Clausewitz's ideas on war and politics?
Well, he has some really interesting thoughts about how wars end.
Yeah.
It's not just about, winning on the battlefield. It's about what comes after
Hmm.
the peace.
Right, because a bad peace can just lead to another war, right?
Exactly. Clausewitz, he says a lot of factors determine how a war ends, what each side wanted to achieve politically, how strong their armies were, how tired they are of fighting, all of that.
Like World War One, the Treaty of Versailles, it punished Germany really harshly. And well, a lot of people think that helped lead to World War Two.
Yeah. A lot of historians say that.
Mhm.
And Clausewitz, he would say, I told you so. He didn't like the idea of punishing the loser too much. He thought it just made things unstable, led to more resentment, more conflict down the road.
So a lasting peace, a good peace, it's not just about, crushing your enemy.
Right. It's about finding a balance, recognizing that everyone has interests,
Right.
and being willing to, to move on, even if it's hard.
It's about building a peace that will actually last. Okay, so we've talked about the end of war, the importance of a just peace. Anything else from Clausewitz before we wrap things up?
Well, remember how we talked about war as a duel of wills, a clash of, of human determination?
Yeah.
We should talk more about the psychological side of warfare. Clausewitz had a lot to say about that.
Yeah, he wasn't just interested in, tanks and strategies. He was really interested in the human element, the things that make people fight or not fight.
Right. He said those psychological factors, they can be just as important as, having the best weapons, sometimes even more important.
So it's not just about who has the bigger army.
Nope. It's about things like morale, courage, discipline, being able to handle hardship, being able to face fear, all that.
Like the Spartans at Thermopylae, they were totally outnumbered, but they fought like crazy. Their morale was incredible.
Yeah. Classic example. Clausewitz said an army with high morale, even if they're outmatched, they can still win. But an army with low morale, they can fall apart, even if they have all the best weapons.
So understanding how your troops are feeling and how the enemy's troops are feeling, that's really important.
Oh, crucial. And Clausewitz talked about all the things that can affect morale. The leader's personality, whether the soldiers believe in what they're fighting for,
Yeah.
even just the experience of winning or losing.
He even said that the fear of losing can make an army fight harder.
Yeah. It's fascinating. It all comes back to that idea that war is, at its heart, a clash of wills, a test of human determination.
Okay, so Clausewitz, he knew that psychology was a big part of war, but did he have any advice on how to actually manage those psychological factors, like how to boost your troops' morale or break the enemy's will?
He did. And this is where, you guessed it, friction comes back in. Remember, friction. It's all those unpredictable things, those intangible things that can mess up your plans.
Right. The fog of war, miscommunication, all that.
Yeah. And Clausewitz said those things, they can really affect morale. Big time. If a commander doesn't plan for friction, their soldiers can get demoralized.
Yeah.
Plans fall apart. The whole campaign can go south.
So even if you have a brilliant strategy on paper, if you don't manage the human element, the psychological stuff, it can all fall apart.
Exactly. And this is where, that Clausewitz genius comes in.
Yeah.
A really great commander, they understand how friction works. They anticipate it, adapt to it. They know how to keep morale up, even when things are really tough.
Like George Washington. He managed to keep the Continental Army going through some really, really hard times. He must have been a master of managing morale.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Washington, he understood that side of things, the human side.
Yeah.
That was a big part of his success, just as important as his military skills.
Okay, so we've talked about friction, how it affects morale, how a good commander can deal with it. What other things about friction should we mention? What else is important for our listeners to know?
Well, one thing to remember is that Clausewitz saw friction as just a part of war. It's
Mhm.
always there. You can't get rid of it completely, but you can try to minimize it by planning carefully, communicating well, building flexibility into your operations, basically creating a culture where people can adapt.
So it's about accepting that things will go wrong, but being prepared to handle it.
Exactly. And that's where training, discipline, and experience come in. A well-trained army, led by commanders who have, been there before, they're going to be much better at handling the inevitable challenges.
It's like that saying, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. You got to be ready for the chaos, the friction.
Exactly. And that means more than just physical training. It's about building mental resilience, adaptability.
So you're saying a good army, they're not just robots following orders. They need to be able to think for themselves, solve problems.
Absolutely. You want soldiers who can make decisions on the fly, be creative,
Yeah.
Figure things out even when the plan goes out the window.
Okay, that makes sense. So friction, it can affect morale. What other ways can it impact a war?
Well, it can really mess with a commander's decision-making.
Yeah.
I mean, Clausewitz, he said friction makes it almost impossible to execute a plan perfectly because there's always missing information, unexpected delays, communication problems, the fog of war.
So even if you have a brilliant plan, actually putting it into action, that's the hard part.
Yep. And this is where Clausewitz's ideas about making decisions under pressure, they become really important. He said a good commander, they have to be able to decide quickly, even when they don't have all the facts.
So you got to be okay with not knowing everything. Trust your gut. Be willing to take risks.
Exactly. And that's where experience, good judgment, that sense of warfare, they all come into play. A good commander, they can often, sense the right move, even when things are unclear. And they're not afraid to act, even if it means changing the plan.
It's like that quote from Eisenhower, plans are worthless, but planning is everything.
Oh, yeah, good one. It's the process of thinking things through, beforehand that really prepares you for those moments when you have to make a decision fast.
Okay, so friction, it can mess with morale, it can mess with decision making. What other big effects can it have?
Think about how friction can affect, the whole course of a war, the back and forth between attack and defense. Sometimes it creates, surprising opportunities or leads to big changes in who's winning.
So it's not just about individual battles. Friction can actually change who wins the whole war.
Absolutely. It can slow an attack down, disrupt supplies, make troops tired, hurt their morale, and it gives the defender a chance to, recover, get stronger, find the attacker's weak spots.
So even the strongest attack can kind of get bogged down by friction, lose its momentum.
Exactly. And again, this brings us back to the culminating point of victory. Even a successful attacker, they will eventually hit a wall. And a smart defender can use that to their advantage.
It's like the Vietnam War. The U.S. had all the firepower, but they got stuck in this long, drawn-out conflict. They couldn't adapt to the terrain. They couldn't win over the local population. Friction just ground them down.
Perfect example. Friction, it can be the deciding factor, even when one side seems to have all the advantages.
Okay, so understanding friction, being ready for it, that's essential for any commander who wants to win.
Oh, yeah. And that's why, again, studying military history is so important, looking at how friction played out in the past, what worked, what didn't.
Learning from the mistakes of the generals who came before.
Exactly. But it's also about, recognizing those timeless principles of war, the things that are always true, no matter what the technology is.
Okay, so we've talked about friction, but Clausewitz, he also talks about different types of military objectives, right? Different things you're trying to achieve in a war.
He does. And he says, look, If you don't understand those objectives and how they connect to the political reasons for the war, you're going to have a bad strategy.
So it's not just about winning battles. It's about, like, having a purpose behind those battles.
Exactly. And Clausewitz, he starts with the most basic objective, destroying the enemy's army.
Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. Wipe out their army, you win.
Well, sometimes. Sometimes that's all it takes.
Yeah.
But Clausewitz says sometimes that's not necessary or even a good idea.
Wait, what? So there are other ways to win, other things you can aim for.
Yeah. And this is where he introduces this idea of the center of gravity.
Hmm.
It's like the enemy's most important source of strength, the thing that holds their whole war effort together.
Okay, so instead of destroying their whole army, you find that one key element and you target that.
Exactly. And that center of gravity, it can be different things. They're a capital city, their main army, key allies, economic resources, even the will of their people to keep fighting. It depends.
It's like in chess. You're not just trying to capture any old piece, you're going after the king.
Exactly. Great analogy. And just like in chess, that center of gravity, it can move. It can change during the war.
And you have to be, like, constantly reassessing, looking for new opportunities.
Right, being adaptable. And that's a big part of how Clausewitz thought about strategy.
Okay, so we've talked about different objectives in war, the idea of the center of gravity, the importance of thinking strategically. Anything else before we wrap up our deep dive into Clausewitz?
Well, we should talk about how wars end. It's not just about winning on the battlefield. It's about what comes after. The peace.
Yeah, because a bad peace can just lead to another war, right?
Exactly. Clausewitz says the way a war ends, it depends on a lot of things. What each side was fighting for, how strong their armies are, how tired everyone is of fighting, all that.
Like World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was really harsh on Germany.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say that's part of why World War II happened.
Right. Clausewitz, he was said that was a mistake.
Mm.
He didn't like punishing the loser too much. Thought it would just lead to more problems down the road.
So for him, a lasting peace, it's not about crushing the enemy. It's about...
It's about finding a balance.
Yeah.
Recognizing that everyone has interests and being willing to, move on, even if it's tough.
It's about building a peace that will actually last. Okay, so we've talked about the end of war, but making a peace that will stick. Anything else from Clausewitz that we should cover?
Well, we've talked about war as a duel of wills. And we should talk more about the psychology of war. Clausewitz had a lot to say about that.
Yeah, he was interested in, the human side of things, not just armies and strategies.
Right. He said those psychological factors are really important. Just as important as having the best weapons. Maybe even more important.
So it's not just about who has the bigger army.
Nope. It's about things like morale, courage, discipline, being able to handle hardship, face fear, all that.
Like the Spartans at Thermopylae. They were totally outnumbered, but they fought so fiercely, their morale was incredible.
Exactly. A classic example. Clausewitz said an army with high morale, even if they're outmatched, they can still win. But a poorly led army, they'll fall apart, even if they have the best weapons.
So you have to understand how your troops are feeling and how the enemy is feeling.
Exactly. Clausewitz talked about all the things that can affect morale, the leader's personality, whether soldiers believe in what they're fighting for, winning and losing.
He even said that the fear of losing, that can make an army fight even harder.
Yeah, interesting, right. It comes back to that idea that war is really this clash of wills, a test of how determined each side is.
Okay, so Clausewitz understood that psychology was a big part of war. But did he have any advice about how to manage those psychological factors? Like how to keep your troops' morale up or how to break the enemy's will?
Oh yeah, he did. And this is where, you guessed it, friction comes back in. Remember, friction is all those unpredictable things, the things that can mess up your plans.
Right. Fog of war, bad communication, all that.
Yep. And he said those things can really damage morale. If you're a commander and you don't account for friction, your soldiers can get demoralized. Plans fall apart. It can be a disaster.
So even if you have a brilliant strategy, if you don't pay attention to the human side of things, the psychology, it can all fall apart.
Exactly. And that's where a great commander comes in, someone who understands how friction works. They can anticipate it, adapt to it. They know how to keep morale up, even when things are really tough.
Like George Washington, he kept the Continental Army together through some incredibly hard times. He must have been a master at managing morale.
Yeah, he understood that side of things, the human side. That was a big part of his success, just as important as his military skills.
Okay, so we've covered friction, how it affects morale, how a good commander can handle it. What else about friction should we talk about?
Well, remember, Clausewitz said that friction is just part of war. It's always there. You can't get rid of it completely, but you can minimize it. By planning carefully, communicating well, building flexibility into your operations, basically create a culture where people can adapt.
So you're saying you have to accept that things will go wrong, but be prepared for it.
Exactly. And that's where training, discipline, experience, all of that comes in.
Right.
A well-trained army, led by commanders who've seen it all, they're going to be much better at dealing with the problems that always come up.
It's like that saying, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. You have to be ready for the chaos, the friction.
Exactly. It means more than just physical training. It's about building mental resilience.
You're saying that soldiers shouldn't just be robots following orders. They need to be able to think for themselves.
Absolutely. You want soldiers who can make decisions on the fly, be creative, figure things out when the plan falls apart.
That makes sense. So friction affects morale. What else does it affect?
Well, think about how friction can mess with the commander's decision-making. Clausewitz said that friction makes it almost impossible to execute a plan perfectly in war. You're always dealing with imperfect information, unexpected delays, communication problems, fog of war.
So even if you have a great plan, actually carrying it out is really hard.
Yep. And this is where Clausewitz's ideas about decision-making under pressure come in. A good commander needs to decide quickly, even when they don't have all the information they need.
Be okay with not knowing everything. Trust your gut.
Right. That's where experience and good judgment come in, and that sense of warfare we talked about. A good commander can often sense the right course of action, even when things are unclear. And they're not afraid to act, even if it means changing the plan.
There's that great quote from Eisenhower, plans are worthless, but planning is everything.
That's a good one. It's the process of thinking things through beforehand that prepares you to make good decisions when you need to act fast.
Okay, so we've talked about friction.
So we've talked about friction, how it affects morale and decision-making, how a good commander can try to manage it. What else about friction? Anything else our listeners should know?
Yeah, I'm still thinking about how, it can change the course of a whole war, create opportunities for one side or the other, like you were saying earlier.
Right, friction. It can slow down an attacker, disrupt their supply lines, exhaust the troops, even hurt morale. And that gives the defender time to regroup, get stronger, figure out how to exploit the attacker's weaknesses.
So it can really turn the tide, even if one side seemed to have the upper hand at first.
Exactly. And that's where Clausewitz's idea of the culminating point of victory is so important. Remember, even a successful attacker, they're going to hit a point where they just can't keep pushing forward. And a good defender, they can recognize that moment and use it to their advantage.
It makes me think of the Vietnam War. The U.S. military had all the firepower, all the technology, but they ended up stuck in this long, drawn-out conflict.
Yeah, great example. They couldn't adapt to the terrain. They had trouble winning over the local population. Friction wore them down.
So sometimes friction can be the deciding factor in a war, even if one side seems to have all the advantages on paper.
Exactly. And that's why Clausewitz put so much emphasis on studying military history. By looking at past campaigns, commanders can learn how friction has played out in different situations, how different leaders have dealt with it, what worked, what didn't.
So you learn from the mistakes of others, but you also learn those timeless principles, the things that are always true about war, no matter the technology involved.
Right. And that brings us to something else Clausewitz talked about, the different types of military objectives in war, the different things you're trying to achieve. He said it's crucial to understand these objectives and how they relate to the bigger political goals of the conflict. If you want a good strategy, you got to get this part right.
Okay, so it's not just about winning battles, it's about winning the right battles, right? The ones that actually help you achieve your political goals.
Exactly. Clausewitz starts with the most basic objective, destroying the enemy's army.
Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. You destroy their army, you win the war.
Well, in theory, yes. Sometimes that's how it works. But Clausewitz points out that destroying the enemy's army isn't always necessary, or even the best idea.
So there are other ways to win a war, other things you can try to accomplish, besides just wiping out the other army.
Yeah, and this is where he talks about the center of gravity. This term, it describes the enemy's most critical source of strength, the thing that holds their whole war effort together, the linchpin.
Okay, so instead of trying to destroy their entire army, you try to find that one key element, that center of gravity,
Yeah.
and you take that out.
You got it. And that center of gravity, it could be different things depending on the situation. Could be their capital city, their main army, of course, key allies, economic resources. Could even be the will of their people to fight.
So it's about thinking strategically, looking beyond just the immediate battles, and trying to find the enemy's weak spot.
Exactly. A smart commander will focus on attacking the enemy's center of gravity instead of getting bogged down in battles that don't really matter in the long run.
It's kind of like a game of chess, where you're not just trying to capture any old piece, you want the king.
Perfect analogy. And just like in chess, the center of gravity can change as the war goes on. A good commander needs to keep reassessing, adapt their strategy as needed.
Okay, so lots to think about here. Different objectives, the idea of the center of gravity, strategic thinking. Anything else we need to cover before we wrap up our deep dive into Clausewitz?
Well, we should definitely talk about how wars end. It's not just about winning on the battlefield. It's about what happens after the fighting stops. It's about making peace.
Yeah, because if you make a bad peace, it can just lead to more fighting later on.
Exactly. And Clausewitz, he said the way a war ends depends on several things. The political goals of each side, how strong their armies were, how tired they are of fighting, all of that.
World War I is a good example of how not to end a war. The Treaty of Versailles was really harsh on Germany, and a lot of historians think that's part of why World War II happened.
Exactly. Clausewitz would have agreed with them. He didn't like punishing the loser too harshly. He thought it just caused more problems down the line.
So a lasting peace, it's not about crushing your enemy.
Nope. It's about finding a balance, recognizing that everyone has interests, and being willing to move forward together, even if it's difficult.
It's about building a peace that will last. Well, we've covered so much ground today. Clausewitz's ideas about the nature of war, the relationship between war and politics, the importance of strategy, the concept of friction. It's a lot to process. What do you think are the most important takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest one is that Clausewitz challenges us to think about war in a much deeper, more nuanced way. It's not just about good guys versus bad guys or heroes and villains. It's about understanding the complex factors that drive conflict, the human element.
It's about seeing war as this dynamic struggle where things are always changing, where the fog of war, those psychological factors, they're always playing a role.
Right. And the second big takeaway is that even though Clausewitz was writing almost 200 years ago, his ideas are still relevant today. His principles of strategy, adaptability, understanding human behavior, learning from history, they're all still incredibly valuable.
Whether you're talking about military conflicts or even just everyday life, negotiations, disagreements, understanding those Clausewitzian principles can really help you.
Absolutely. And finally, I think Clausewitz's work is a call to action. He's saying, don't just sit back and accept the chaos and uncertainty of war. Study it, understand it, and find ways to manage its destructive potential.
So it's not enough to just read on war. It's about taking those insights and using them to make the world a better place.
Exactly. Well, I think we've reached the culminating point of our own deep dive into the mind of Karl von Clausewitz.
We hope you found it as fascinating as we did. We encourage you to keep exploring Clausewitz's work and see how his ideas can help you make sense of the world.
As Clausewitz himself said, the study of war is meant to educate the mind, not to teach recipes.
That's something to think about. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.